A bold, minimalist design. In the center, a wide, horizontal brown band runs across a black background. In the middle, the text, Fort Vancouver Conversations, appears in uppercase black letters, creating a strong contrast. Place of change. Three individuals seated in front of a native blanket hanging on a wall displaying repeating patterns, with stacks of prominent horizontal lines creating 5 bands of open space that contain alternating patterns of rounded geometric symbols with jagged edges. The stack of lines from the top is dark blue, light purple, red, orange, orange, red, and then light purple and dark blue again. The light purple and the orange lines are about twice as big as the others. The alternative patterns use the same colors of dark blue, dark red, light red, and white to create the shapes, but one band emphasizes the darker colors and the adjacent band emphasizes the lighter colors, creating contrasts between the two. Various artifacts sit on the table: a carved wooden bucket, a ceramic bowl, a basket, and various small items. Colin Fogarty, based on the text overlay, the guest interviewer, is on the left, wears glasses and a plaid short-sleeved shirt. He is holding a couple of sheets of paper with text. In the center, Cheryl Pooley, a light-skinned female with dark blonde hair, blue eyes, and large clear-framed glasses, wearing a light blue top with a darker cardigan. Megan Huff, a fair-skinned female with dark blonde hair, black glasses, wearing a National Park Service uniform with gold name tag and a National Park Service patch on her left shoulder. All three individuals have small microphones attached to their collars.
So thank you both for being here. Go ahead and introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, good morning. My name is Cheryl Pauley, and I work for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde as their Cultural Protection Coordinator. And that means that I work on behalf of the tribe for compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which sounds very bureaucratic and boring and actually isn't, and is really fun. But my background is in archaeology, and I was trained as an archaeologist. And so that is also something that I bring to conversation today.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Megan Huff, and I'm a museum curator for the National Park Service here at Fort Vancouver National Historic Site.
The interviewer nods his head intently as Megan smiles while speaking.
I've been here for about 10 years, or actually more than that even, more than 10 years. And my responsibility here is taking care of the park's museum collection, which is about 2.8 million artifacts, mostly archaeological, but also historic items that have been donated by members of the community.
So in our earlier video, we talked a lot about how Native Americans and tribal members are misrepresented and misunderstood in general, and so many myths. In this conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about tools and technology. And when we think about technology, we think of modern things, and so much of Native American technology and tools are defined or misrepresented as rustic and somehow simple. Is that true, or have we completely misunderstood the role of technology in Native American life historically?
Well, I think one of the problems that you have when you're dealing with understanding pre-contact Native American life is that many of those assumptions and interpretations are based on what archaeologists are recovering from the archaeological record. And we have to remember that even when an archaeologist is doing a large excavation, they're probably only recovering maybe 1% of the site. And of that, the material culture that remains behind is probably only 1% of everything that was there. And so you have to consider, like here at Fort Vancouver, before the fort was built, the homes of the people here were made of cedar, and they were cedar plank houses along the river. And that would not have preserved well in the archaeological record. And it's also not something that, remains as a large monument behind that other cultures coming in would see, oh, here we have this, you know, pyramid or something like that. People from European cultures would think of as architectural. And so that's part of what, I think contributes to that misunderstanding of Native American life being simple and rustic.
And so, Megan, when you look at artifacts found here at the site, does it seem primitive?
I wouldn't say that at all. I think there's lots of evidence of really complicated, advanced kinds of technology being used to make tools like we see in our collection. I also agree that there are a lot of blind spots with archaeology, a lot of things that we just cannot uncover or recover from underground at this point in time. And that's where our relationships with tribes come into play, and consultation and learning from you all about what we're never going to be able to find just by looking underground.
If we were to magically, say, go back 3,000 years, what kinds of technologies, what kind of materials, what kind of homes would we see here?
So here you would see again the cedar plank houses that I described before, and then within those cedar plank houses, within the homes, you would see everybody's belongings. And that's actually something that I did want to mention too, is that for tribal people looking at these things that we now call artifacts, they are people's belongings and they are something that was passed down through generations from one to another. And so, of those belongings, you might see a wooden bowl and a wooden ladle, or maybe a carved horn ladle or spoon. You might see really beautiful mats made of tule or cattail that would have kept the floor warm for people. You would have seen leather clothing and cedar clothing, and all of these things that I just described aren't going to preserve.
Cheryl and the ranger exchange looks of enthusiasm and keen interest.
Yeah, well, and I think it's all the things you just mentioned, which you would find here at that time, are all made through various kinds of technology. They don't just occur in nature, clothing and bowls and things like that. They're made by people. I think in the 21st century, when we think of technology, we think of one thing, the first thing you think of is probably a phone or an iPad or something like that. We don't necessarily really dig deep into what technology means and what it means to really make something and how you make something.
And when you're thinking about technology too, when you think about all the different items that go into making your phone and
Hmm.
how rare those are, how hard they are to get, how far afield we have to go to get the rare earth minerals or things like that, we're seeing that reflected though in tribal cultures in the past because you have obsidian coming from obsidian cliffs here to Fort Vancouver. And then that obsidian is also being traded all the way out to the Midwest of the United States. And so you have these very large, very complex trade networks that we see today with our technologies that we use, and we also see in the past.
How do you think the fact that the materials were not preserved over the generations and the hundreds and thousands of years, how do you think that contributes to our misunderstanding or misrepresentation of Native American life historically?
I think one of the things that happens when we're taking the archaeological materials and then taking it to the interpretive story is that we focus so much on what that little bit tells us, and we don't think about what's not being represented in the record.
Absolutely. I think a lot about sort of the missing artifacts in the collection and the stories that are not impossible to tell, but just a little more challenging to share with the public because it's great to have a physical example of what you're talking about when you're teaching someone about someone who lived in the past. Um, so we just have to be really creative, I think, when we are missing certain kinds of artifacts, especially like you're talking about with women's stories, children's stories. These are the untold and undertold stories of the past, really. And like I said, it's all about being creative and working with partners and knowing what you don't know and working to fill in those gaps.
Mhm.
When we think about prehistory or ancient history, often we hear about civilizations, and we don't necessarily learn in schools that there were civilizations that lived here as sophisticated as what you might find in the Middle East or in Europe. From what you know, how would you characterize the civilizations that lived here?
The Chinook civilization, particularly, is very complex because of their extensive trade networks. They had so much control and relationship with different parties along the river. And of course, that's recent times. But you think about how complex it is to have trade networks that go all the way from Vancouver Island down to California, out to the Midwest to bring all these things together. And Also, the deep understanding that people needed to have of their landscape to be able to manage the landscape for the most abundance, for having the most fish, and to ensure that the traditions and the practices allowed others to also have fish upriver, and then managing the landscape with fire, putting fire on the land at the right time to allow for good production of camas and acorn, and that deep understanding and scientific study of their homes and how that really isn't reflected in the archaeological record either when we're thinking about the untold story, because how do you put into what would remain in the archaeological record of extensive land management, and archaeologists are working on that kinds of study through understanding some fire ecology and things like that, but it's trickier to suss out in the record.
Well, and I think with the Hudson's Bay Company, when they moved into this area to establish their fur trade and build their forts, I think they very much recognized, although not necessarily respected, the fact that there were complex civilizations here because they were capitalizing on them. They were relying on indigenous guides and to a certain extent, encouraging unions between indigenous women and men in the fur trade as a way to take advantage of the resources that were here.
And what happened to those native tools and technologies and materials after European contact?
Well, lots of times, one of the things that I think is so fascinating about that period of European contact is that you have Native American technology adopting European materials. And so you can see an example of that here on the table.
The artifacts on the table: a wooden bucket, approximately 15 inches in height, 10 inches in circumference, appears to have two handle-like extensions protruding 2 inches in length from the bucket. Carved on the handles are two abstract human figures with smiles. The wood is light brown hue. A small ceramic white bowl with a blue flower pattern has a triangular hole on base and a large chip on the rim. A basket appears to be woven with two variants: grass stems in knots, and a small tag attached with a string has the number 317.
Where you can look at this porcelain bowl here from the Fort Vancouver collection, but you can see that porcelain point
The triangular porcelain point is in the shape of an arrowhead.
that's up there in the front that has been shaped into traditional technologies of the peoples of this place using new material. But I think this is a perfect example of the types of materials that you would have seen being adopted here as well, because here at Fort Vancouver, you would have had fragmentary porcelain. I know that you mentioned that you have some napped glass in your collection, and it's that same example of that moment in time as technology and materials are quickly shifting.
You also see items like the thimble that's on the table here.
A brass thimble with a hole in the cap and a jagged, chipped rim.
These are items, thimbles were brought over by the bucketfuls, tons of thimbles, as trade items, but they weren't being used as thimbles necessarily. They were being adapted to what people wanted them to be used for and what they thought was beautiful, which in this case was essentially a bead punching a hole through that tip of the thimble, which does not make it very effective to use as a thimble. So now it's a bead.
The basket, I think, is a really good illustration of the complexity that goes into making a really simple, rustic thing. Because someone might look at that and go, "Oh, how simple, how rustic, how primitive." But making a basket is incredibly difficult, and basket makers put a lot of time and effort into just being able to learn the very basics of basket making. And I've tried to make baskets and I'm not very good at it, but I hope to get better someday. So there's a skill and technique that goes into making the basket itself. And then there's four different materials in this basket. There's three-edged sedge, there's bear grass, there's cattail, and there's cedar. And each of those things need to be gathered at the right time. They need to be cared for. The cedar needs to hang in the house and dry for a year before it can be used for weaving. The others need to be gathered and cared for at their right times. And so you need to be able to travel all throughout your homelands to gather these items. And only then do you have everything you need to make this basket.
And what about this bowl? Tell us about this bowl.
Okay, so this is a maple burl wood bowl, and it's one that I brought from our collections at Chichalu because it really is, again, one of those things that may not preserve well in the archaeological record, but would have been a common belonging to have in your house. And one of the things that you can notice this edge here is you can see some of the Chinookan motifs, and you can see the face and the rib cage that are often found in Chinookan art. You also see some of these triangle patterns along the edge of the bowl. And that's one of the things that you see reflected a lot in Chinookan art as well, is that pattern that reflects the mountains, that reflects the cascades around us and the peaks of the mountains around us, and how that landscape then gets reflected into the materials and the items that people are using every day.
But I think it's so important to know that people in the past were tremendously clever. They were smart and creative and resourceful, like coming up with the plan for the basket alone and then deciding to what you needed and when and gathering all of those supplies and taking the time. It takes so much skill, as you mentioned, to create these items. And that's something that I hope comes through with the items in our collection and the interpretation we do is that, we may be inventing iPhones now, but they were inventing a lot of things back then as well.
Is one of the themes that you see in this material, in this artwork, holding to tradition while also embracing innovation? Is that something that you see in the archaeological record?
I definitely think so. Again, that porcelain point is a really good example of traditional technology being used on new materials, and that innovation right there.
I wonder if you also see this with art. Like we're looking at, well, first of all the materials that you see, it seems to me, is it true that art is incorporated into it in some way? That there's no separation necessarily between technology, a tool, a bowl, and art. It's all one and the same. Am I correct?
I think that that is definitely true. I think that's true today. I mean, think of Apple products and the emphasis on making it look good as well as it being functional. And I think one of the things that you see reflected in the items here is that everyday items also have their own beauty. And you see that, in the care taken to shape the bowl and choosing to have a little bit of the pattern of the porcelain show on
Mm.
the arrowhead. And I'm sure the napper at the time was thinking about this would look beautiful as well as serve the function that I needed to serve.
And do you see that in the collection here at the park?
The connection between art and technology.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that even in the SPO dishes that we find, um, there's always been sort of this impulse with people to want things to be beautiful and decorative, not just useful and functional. So that comes through in a lot of ways. I mean, looking again at that thimble, it's was something that was meant to be really functional, really utilitarian, only seen by, the person, probably a woman, who would use it while she was sewing, and that's the only time she would use it. But transforming it into something that is meant to be displayed and it is part of something bigger, a bigger design, is exactly that merger between art and function or art and technology.
Exactly. That's a great example.
Hmm.
And do you see native artists also embracing tradition, but also innovation and in a modern way today?
Oh, definitely. And I think that's one thing to think about too, is that Native peoples are part of the modern world, and we show up to meetings with our cell phones, and people, instead of taking a canoe to the falls, are driving down the highway in a modern car. And I think one of the things that we see is the traditions and the stories and the feelings of place being brought forward in new ways with new materials, and people are again shifting medium and art. We definitely have carvers who are doing amazing artwork right now, but we also have tribal community who are doing digital art. We have tribal community who are amazing modern artists. And so you see that art bringing forward the story of the tribe and illustrating not only art for art's sake, but also the stories and the landscape and history and the experience of being a tribal person from this area.
Yeah. And how is the National Historic Site here embracing that in terms of art in the visitor center?
We were hearing that there was not really a representation of the Indigenous point of view, perspectives, and story here, that an average visitor could spend an afternoon, a day here at Fort Vancouver and not get any sense that Native people were here or that Native people are still here. So this was something that we were able to remedy around 2015, 2016 when we did a large rehabilitation of the visitor center. So what we added, the look of it now, is that right when you walk in the doors of the visitor center, you are greeted by a piece of art called Spirit Pole, which was done by Yakama Nation artist Toma Villa. And it is monumental in size. And it is basically a tree that is split into two pieces and planted in the floor. And the two sides of it represent the north and south sides of the Columbia River, so what is now Oregon and Washington. So as you walk through it, you are the river, you are walking along the path of the Columbia River. The carvings on either side of the tree are meant to represent sort of the machinery, the technology of the world and the universe. And inset are these glass masks that represent different elements, animals, plants, freshwater, saltwater, spirit, fire, beaver, salmon is one of the masks. So right away when you walk in, that's what you're greeted with.
The welcome area of Fort Vancouver National Historic Site. Gifford Pin Show National Forest. This information is just behind the help desk on a shining wood-paneled wall. Next to the text are the organization's perspective plaques, a large welcome desk with paper-like items on the top, a small tabletop brochure rack. In the center, two wooden floor-to-ceiling pillars carved and adorned with multiple mask-like figures in various colors, shapes, and designs. Just beyond the pillars, a metal rack with brochures stands in front of a large floor-to-ceiling window right next to the main entrance doors. There is a handicap icon on the middle of the door panels.
And that is also located right in front of the ranger desk, so you cannot miss it at all, impossible. And then next to the ranger desk, just a little bit further into the visitor center, we have what we call the expressions gallery.
Two barrel-shaped headdresses, made of feathers, rest on a lollipop-like stand with a band around the bottom of the material of the head, which leads down a thin pole to a ceramic-like base in two tones of brown with the darker brown at the base.
This is a place for artists from communities with a traditional tie to the site can exhibit artwork.
In a glass case, a jeweler's necklace display adorned with a lei-like flower necklace in purple, white, and beige. Behind that display is the top of another necklace with bright yellow flowers. Below at the bottom, a choker in a rounded horseshoe form in yellow with dark spotted design throughout.
So we've had a number of exhibits by indigenous artists and Native Hawaiian artists that present their perspective on their own work. You know, we really want it to be a place where we step back and let a different perspective come through and bring that to our visitors.
And how do visitors respond to encountering modern art when they might be expecting something historic or very traditional?
Well, some of our artists are working in fairly traditional mediums, so basketry and leather items, things like that. And some are doing very modern graphic design, and I think and some are doing both. And some are using traditional designs with modern materials and mediums. And I think that for visitors, our hope is that what they'll bring away from it or take away from it is this idea of continuity of culture, the idea that Indigenous people are still here and they're still tied to this site and a really important part of the management of this historic site. And so I think that in the visitor center,
An expanding view of the Welcome Center with a gift shop drifting in the background. A large wall poster reads, 100 Years of Honoring, over an image of a dusk, mountainous landscape.
We hope to kind of give them something maybe they weren't expecting in the sense of really being upfront and center about modern Native cultures that show the story of not just Fort Vancouver, but also Vancouver Barracks in a thematic way. So it's not a timeline of history where different things sort of drop off and are never mentioned again, like Native history. But it's around a theme like that is universally relatable, like home or love or family, and bringing in a lot of different stories from different time periods together.
This assumption that Native Americans are this monolithic society with no diversity within Native American culture. And I find that a lot. And I think that is something that sometimes when people are looking at artifacts in a museum or an interpretive center, they think to themselves, oh, I've seen arrowheads before. That's just like where I come from in Florida. And it's a not it's an assumption that because the technology form is similar, that the society and the culture is similar, and not necessarily getting into that deep story behind all the different things of each of the different Native American nations having that deep relationship to their homelands.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much. Do you have any final thoughts on this discussion about technology and Native culture today?
I think one of the things that I would just encourage everybody to take away from our conversation is that there's always more than just the item that you see on the table in front of you. And there's always a huge story behind that item. And so ask those questions and get engaged. Ask the community that you work with how they made those things, why they made those things, what they need to do to be able to make those things. And you'll have a much richer understanding of the cultures that you're working with.
Absolutely. I would say, for what I would hope for that folks would take away is just the importance of being curious and asking questions and not being afraid to challenge what you know or what you were taught. And really this is something I work on all the time is getting comfortable, feeling uncomfortable and finding out where you hit that uncomfortable wall and figuring out what you need to do, what you need to learn to get over it, get to the other side, and it makes you a better person, it makes you more productive as a member of society, and it makes you more knowledgeable about our world and our past.
Okay. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A graphic image of an evergreen tree towering over a man with his backpack and stick walking east on a single line trail. Above the line, text, the fun for people in parks. Below the line, text, enhancing the visitor experience. A graphic image of the corner of a wooden fort with an octagon tower, showing 3 sides with a window in each section. A weather vane protrudes on top of the black, downward slanted roof. In the background, based on its distinctive peak, Mount Hood, known as Y East by the indigenous people of the region, rises above peaks and valleys. Just in front of the fort, 2 tall Douglas fir evergreen trees, next to the image of the fort. Large brown text with white specks in all capital letters, Friends, just under in between 2 gold stars, text in black, of Fort Vancouver.